a journey to the edge of death, where the hospital bed becomes a battlefield, and the only weapon left is a prayer. He was a walking grave. For 30 years, Peregrine Laziosi turned his body into a living sacrifice, a penance that eventually demanded a horrific price. By the end, he carried a leg so foul, so black with corruption, that his own brothers could not stand the stench of his prayers. He was a man rotting alive, waiting for the saw to finish what the devil started. But in the darkest hour, when the metal was sharpened and the fire was lit, the impossible happened. The dead flesh didn't just heal, it obeyed. This is the terrifying, beautiful story of the saint who forced biology to kneel before faith. The air in Forlì in those days tasted of iron and dust. It was a city on edge, a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark arrived in the form of a man named Philip Benizi. Philip was the prior general of the servants of Mary, the Servites, a new order dedicated to the sorrows of the Virgin. The Pope, hoping to bring the rebellious city back into the fold without resorting to a military siege, sent Philip as a special envoy. It was a suicide mission. Sending a friar to preach peace in Forlì was like sending a lamb to negotiate with a pack of starving wolves. Philip came armed not with guards or weapons, but with words. He came to speak of reconciliation, of the danger to their immortal souls, of the love that binds the church to her children even when they are wayward. News of Philip's arrival spread through the taverns and the marketplaces like wildfire. To Peregrine and his gang, this was not an olive branch, it was an invasion. It was an insult. The audacity of this barefoot friar walking into their stronghold to lecture them on obedience was intolerable. Peregrine rallied his followers. They moved through the streets like a dark tide, gathering momentum, their laughter sharp and cruel. They did not intend to listen to a sermon. They intended to crush a spirit. They planned to humiliate Philip Benizi so thoroughly that he would flee the city and never look back. The plan was simple: disruption, intimidation, and, if necessary, violence. They were young, they were drunk on their own invincibility, and they saw themselves as the defenders of Forlì's liberty against the encroachments of Rome. Philip Benizi stood on the steps of the cathedral, a building that stood silent and empty due to the interdict. A crowd had gathered, some out of curiosity, some out of a desperate hunger for spiritual food, but many simply to watch the spectacle. Philip began to speak. His voice was not the booming thunder of a demagogue, but it carried a strange, penetrating clarity. He spoke of peace. He spoke of the wounds of Italy, bleeding out while brothers fought brothers. He pleaded with the citizens of Forlì to lay down their hatred, to return to the sacraments, to find unity in Christ. For a moment, the crowd was hushed, captivated by the sheer sincerity of the man. But Peregrine, standing at the edge of the square, felt a rising bile of contempt. To him, these were the words of a manipulator. He signaled his men. The heckling began. It started as a low rumble, jeers and insults thrown like stones into a calm pond. "Go back to Rome," they shouted. "We need no Roman collars here." Peregrine pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes locked on the friar. The people parted before him, fearful of his temper. He was the prince of the city's rebellion, and this was his stage. He marched up the steps, his boots striking the stone with an authoritative rhythm. He stood before Philip Benizi, towering over the older man. The contrast was stark. Peregrine, in his fine silks and leather, flushed with rage and youth. Philip, in his rough patched habit, weary from travel but calm as a deep lake. Peregrine began to shout, unleashing a torrent of abuse. He mocked Philip's order. He mocked the Pope. He mocked the very concept of peace. He called Philip a spy, a hypocrite, a leech. The crowd, sensing blood, began to roar their approval. They were a mob now, and Peregrine was their conductor. But Philip did not break. He did not step back. He did not raise his voice to shout over the abuse. He simply looked at Peregrine. He looked at him not with fear, nor with anger, but with a profound, unsettling sorrow. It was a look that Peregrine could not understand. It was a look that stripped away the political slogans and the bravado, peering directly into the chaotic, frightened boy hiding behind the mask of the rebel leader. This silence, this refusal to engage in the fight, infuriated Peregrine. It denied him the conflict he craved. It made his anger feel impotent. In a moment of blind, white-hot fury, Peregrine lost all control. He drew back his hand, heavy with the rings of his station, and struck Philip Benizi across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the piazza. It was a sharp, cracking sound that silenced the mob instantly. Time seemed to freeze. To strike a priest was a grave sin. To strike a papal legate was a crime that could carry the death penalty, or at least permanent exile. But more than the legal consequences, there was a sudden collective gasp at the sheer brutality of the act. The violence had crossed a line. Peregrine stood there, his hand stinging, his chest heaving, waiting for the retaliation. He expected Philip to curse him. He expected the friar to call down the wrath of God, or at least to signal for help. He braced himself for a fight, his fists clenched, ready to brawl right there on the cathedral steps. But the fight never came. Slowly, deliberately, Philip Benizi turned his head back to the center. His cheek was already reddening, the imprint of Peregrine's hand clearly visible on the pale skin. A trickle of blood ran from his lip. Philip took a breath, and then, with a gentleness that was more terrifying than any sword, he turned his other cheek toward Peregrine. He did not speak a word of condemnation. He whispered a prayer. It was a prayer for Peregrine. "May God forgive you, my son," he murmured. His eyes filled with tears, not of pain, but of compassion. "May God grant you peace." Peregrine Laziosi stared at the man he had just struck. He looked at the offered cheek. In that fraction of a second, the entire foundation of his life shattered. All his theories about power, about strength, about the weakness of the church, they all collapsed before the devastating strength of nonviolence. He had expected a battle, and he was met with love. He had offered hatred, and he was given forgiveness before he had even asked for it. The silence of the square pressed down on him. The cheers of his followers had died out, replaced by an awkward, heavy confusion. They were waiting for their leader to strike again, to finish the job. But Peregrine could not move. His arm fell to his side, as if paralyzed. The rage that had fueled him for years suddenly drained away, leaving behind a cold, hollow void. He felt a sudden, crushing wave of shame. It was a nausea of the soul, a realization of his own monstrousness. He backed away. He stumbled down the steps, his eyes wide, seeing nothing but the bruised face of the saint. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the calls of his friends. He ran. He ran from the square, ran from the eyes of the people, ran from the city center. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He found himself in the outskirts of the city, in the solitude of his own room, locking the door against the world. That night was the longest of his life. It was a descent into hell. Peregrine threw himself onto the floor. The image of Philip's face burned into his retinas. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the sound of the slap. He saw the blood on the friar's lip. He realized that he, Peregrine, the noble defender of Forli, was nothing more than a brute. He had struck a defenseless man. He had struck holiness itself. The pride that had sustained him was gone, and without it he felt naked and wretched. He wept. He wept with the violent, shaking sobs of a man who realizes he has wasted his life. He questioned everything. If Philip Benizi, a man who had every right to destroy him, could offer forgiveness, then what was this God that Philip served? What was this power that could endure humiliation without striking back? Peregrine realized that Philip possessed a strength that he, with all his swords and mobs, did not have. Philip was free. Peregrine was a slave to his own anger. For 3 days and 3 nights Peregrine did not eat. He remained in his room wrestling with his demons. The political slogans of the Ghibellines now tasted like ash in his mouth. He didn't care about the emperor anymore. He didn't care about the Pope's politics. He only cared about the burning hole in his conscience. He needed to apologize. The need was a physical hunger. He had to find Philip Benizi. He had to kneel before him and beg for pardon, even if it meant public humiliation, even if it meant the end of his reputation in Forli. He emerged from his home a ghost of his former self. He sought out the place where the servitors were staying. When he found Philip, the friar was in prayer. Peregrine did not march in this time, he crawled. He threw himself at Philip's feet, washing them with his tears, choking out words of apology. He expected a penance, a harsh rebuke. Instead, Philip lifted him up and embraced him. The man he had struck held him like a lost brother returning from a war. In that embrace the rebel died, and the saint was conceived. But conception is only the beginning. The gestation would be a long, agonizing darkness. Peregrine did not just want forgiveness, he wanted transformation. He asked to be admitted into the order. He asked to wear the habit of the man he had assaulted. The admission was granted, but Peregrine was not content with the ordinary life of a friar. He felt that he had a debt to pay, a debt of violence that could only be balanced by an extreme, almost violent act of love and self-denial. He looked at his body, the strong, healthy body of a young noble that had been used to intimidate and hurt, and he decided that this body must be broken so that his soul could be rebuilt. He began to devise a penance, a rule of life so severe that it would terrify his superiors had they known its full extent. He looked at the comforts of the world, the soft beds, the chairs, the moments of rest, and he rejected them all. He made a vow, a secret covenant with God in the silence of his heart. It was a vow of verticality. He would stand before the Lord as a sentinel who had abandoned his post and was now returning to duty. Whenever humanly possible, specifically during the long hours of the divine office and private prayer, he refused to sit. He would not allow himself the luxury of resting his weight. For 30 years, he imposed upon himself a grueling discipline of standing, turning his own body into a trembling pillar of atonement. He did not know yet that this vow, born of spiritual fervor, would eventually turn against him biologically. He did not know that gravity is a relentless adversary, and that by refusing to rest his legs, he was slowly, day by day, destroying the intricate valves of his veins. He only knew that he had been a man of pride, and now he must be a man of endurance. The slap in the piazza was the end of Peregrine the warrior, but it was the beginning of Peregrine the penitent. And the path he chose was one of jagged stones and silence, leading straight into a darkness that no human mind could anticipate. This was not a vow of mere discomfort. It was a daily, grinding erosion of the self. In the confessional, while the penitents of Forli knelt comfortably on the cushioned wood, pouring out their sins, Peregrine stood behind the screen. Sweat, cold and clammy, would bead on his forehead, hidden by the cowl. As a merchant confessed his greed or a housewife her anger, Peregrine's legs would tremble violently, the muscles spasming in silent revolt. He would grip the wooden frame of the confessional until his knuckles turned white, using the structure to keep from collapsing, all while his voice remained steady, gentle, offering absolution to everyone but himself. The refectory became another theater of torture, while 80 other friars sat on benches, breaking bread and sharing the relief of the midday meal. Peregrine ate standing in the corner, leaning slightly against the cold stone pillar, his only concession to balance, never to rest. Sleep, the universal refuge of the suffering, became a series of jagged interruptions. He did not lie down. He would prop himself against the wall of his cell, drifting into a shallow, fitful doze. But the moment his body relaxed, his knees would buckle, jerking him awake with a gasp, forcing him to re-engage the very muscles that were screaming for release. For 3 decades, the night did not bring peace. It brought only the long, lonely watch of a sentry guarding a fortress that was slowly crumbling from within. But this vow was a silent war declared against the very laws of physics. For 30 years, the penitent of Forli refused to sit. To the spiritual observer, this was a heroic feat of endurance. However, to the clinical eye, to the physician who understands the delicate hydraulics of the human circulatory system, it was a slow, methodical suicide of the lower extremities. The human body is engineered for movement, for the rhythmic contraction of muscles that pump blood back to the heart against the pull of the earth. When a man stands still for decades, locking his knees and bearing his weight upon the same few inches of bone and flesh, he invites a biological catastrophe. Gravity, relentless and unforgiving, began to pool the blood in Peregrine's legs. The veins, those fragile vessels designed to carry deoxygenated blood back to the lungs, were subjected to a hydrostatic pressure they were never evolved to withstand. Year after year, the valves within his veins, tiny, delicate flaps of tissue meant to prevent backflow, began to fail. They buckled under the weight of the stagnant column of blood. The veins twisted and distended, bulging beneath the skin like knotted ropes, blue and angry. This was the onset of chronic venous insufficiency, a condition where the blood, unable to return to the heart, begins to seep into the surrounding tissue. His lower legs swelled, the skin stretching tighter and tighter until it became translucent, shiny, and fragile as parchment. The cellular waste products that should have been flushed away began to accumulate, turning the tissue hard and woody, a phenomenon known as lipodermatosclerosis. The legs that had once carried the swaggering noble through the streets of Forli were now heavy, leaden anchors, burning with a dull, constant ache that no prayer could alleviate. But the true horror began when the skin finally gave way. It likely started as a minor injury, perhaps a scratch or a bruise that went unnoticed during his long vigils of prayer. In a healthy body, such a wound would scab and heal within days. In Peregrine's compromised flesh, starved of oxygen and drowning in stagnant blood, the wound did not heal. It opened. It became a malignant, non-healing sore, what the physicians of the time called a cancerous ulcer. It was a crater in the flesh that wept fluid constantly. In the 14th century, the concept of sterility was non-existent. The air was thick with unseen microbial life, and the monastery, for all its sanctity, was a place of dust, wool, and stone, a perfect breeding ground for infection. Bacteria found their way into the open sore on his right leg, and finding a host with no defenses, they began to feed. The transition from a chronic ulcer to necrotic gangrene is a descent into a biological nightmare. The infection deepened, burrowing past the skin and the fat, eating into the fascia and the muscle. The inflammatory response of his body was violent. His leg became a furnace, radiating a heat that could be felt through his habit. The color of the flesh shifted from the angry red of inflammation to the bruised purple of ischemia, and finally to the terrifying lifeless black of necrosis. This was not merely a wound, it was death itself, taking up residence in the body of the living. The tissue was dying cell by cell, decomposing while attached to a man who still breathed, still prayed, and, miraculously, still stood. The pain of such a condition is difficult to articulate. It is not the sharp, screaming pain of a cut, but a deep, throbbing agony that resides in the marrow. It is a pain that has a pulse, a rhythm of suffering that beats in time with the heart. It feels as though the bone is being crushed in a vise, or as if ice water and molten lead are being poured into the veins simultaneously. Peregrine lived with this sensation every second of every hour. There was no respite. Because he refused to sit, refused to elevate the leg, the pressure never abated. Every moment of standing forced more blood into the ruined vessels, feeding the swelling, stretching the nerve endings to their breaking point. Sleep became a series of feverish, fragmented hallucinations. He would lean against the wall of his cell, sweat pouring down his face, his body trembling with the effort to remain upright, while the fire in his leg consumed his consciousness. Yet, as excruciating as the pain was, it was the olfactory assault that marked the true beginning of his passion. Gangrene has a specific, undeniable signature. It is the smell of putrefaction, of proteins breaking down into cadaverine and putrescin. It is a heavy, cloying scent, sweet, sickly, and utterly repulsing. It triggers a primal alarm in the human brain, a biological imperative to flee from the source of contagion. At first, the smell was faint, a stale odor confined to the bandages. But as the necrosis spread, consuming more muscle and threatening the bone, the stench became a physical presence. It filled his small cell. It seeped into the wool of his habit. It clung to his skin and hair. No amount of washing, no amount of strong herbs or incense could mask the reality that a part of him was rotting. Peregrine became a prisoner of his own decay. He was a man of deep sensitivity, a former aristocrat who had known the perfumes of the court and the crisp air of the piazza. Now he lived in a cloud of corruption. He could smell his own death. Every breath he took was a reminder of his mortality and his wretchedness. The psychological toll of this cannot be overstated. To watch one's own body turn black and die is a trauma that fractures the mind. He watched the blackness spread, creeping up from his shin toward his knee, an encroaching shadow that promised an agonizing end. He saw the pus, thick and foul, weeping from the cracks in the blackened crust. This was a horror stripped of all romance. There was no glorious battle, no clean sword stroke. There was only the slow, humid, stinking disintegration of the self. And in the midst of this biological collapse, Peregrine continued his duties. He hobbled through the cloisters, leaning heavily on a stick, his face gray with pain, his eyes burning with fever. He tried to hide the severity of his condition, but the smell betrayed him. It announced his arrival before he was seen. It lingered long after he had left. He became a walking contagion, a source of visceral discomfort to everyone he encountered. The fever that accompanied the gangrene brought with it a delirium that blurred the lines between the spiritual and the hallucinatory. Sepsis is a poison that affects the brain. As the bacteria released toxins into his bloodstream, Peregrine's mind would have oscillated between clarity and confusion. He would endure chilling rigors, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as his body temperature spiked, followed by drenching sweats that left him dehydrated and weak. In these moments of feverish vulnerability, the demons of his past must have returned to haunt him. The pain in his leg became the physical manifestation of his guilt. Was this the hand he had used to strike Philip Benizi, now rotting as punishment? Was this the arrogance of his youth being carved out of him piece by piece? The theology of suffering suggests that pain can be redemptive, but in the throes of sepsis, pain feels only like a senseless cruelty. He was fighting a war on two fronts: the biological war against the bacteria that were devouring his flesh, and the spiritual war against the despair that threatened to devour his soul. The doctors of the time, such as they were, looked upon him with a mixture of pity and professional helplessness. Their remedies, poultices of figs, washes of vinegar, hot irons, were futile against the tide of necrosis. They knew, and Peregrine knew, that the corruption was deep. It had reached the bone. The tibia, the primary weight-bearing bone of the lower leg, was likely infected, a condition known as osteomyelitis. This deep bone infection causes a pressure and a pain that is relentless, a gnawing that feels as though a rodent is chewing on the skeleton from the inside out. And still, he stood. The sheer mechanics of his survival are baffling. How does a man with a rotting leg, poisoned blood, and a fever of 104 degrees continue to stand for the divine office? It speaks to a strength of will that borders on the supernatural, or perhaps the insane. But Peregrine was not insane. He was in love. He was in love with the crucified Christ, and he believed that by sharing in the physical agony of the Passion, he was participating in some mysterious way in the redemption of the world. He offered his gangrene as a prayer. He offered the stench of his wound as incense. But the world around him, the human world of the monastery and the city, was less capable of such theological abstraction. To them, he was simply a dying man who smelled unbearable. The horror of his condition was about to force a separation, a quarantine that would strip him of his last earthly comfort, the presence of his brothers. The physical rot was nearly complete. The social rot was about to begin. The monastery is a closed ecosystem, and in such tight quarters, Peregrine's condition became impossible to ignore. The smell of necrosis is invasive. It respects no sacred boundaries. It drifted into the refectory, turning communal meals into nausea-inducing ordeals. It seeped into the chapel, choking the chant of the choir. Sympathy slowly curdled into revulsion. The brothers tried to be charitable, but biology is a powerful instinct. They began to flinch when he passed. They held their breath. The cohesive harmony of the brotherhood was being dismantled by the biological reality of one man's penance. The whispers began. They were not malicious at first, just the practical concerns of men trying to live together. It is becoming difficult to breathe in the choir, one might have said. Perhaps Brother Peregrine should stand near the door. Then, as the weeks turned into months and the stench grew more potent, the whispers hardened. The presence of Peregrine became a disruption. During the chanting of the divine office, when the voices of the friars were meant to rise in unison like a single angelic choir, the brother standing next to Peregrine would falter, covering his nose with his sleeve, his eyes watering not from devotion, but from the biological assault of the rotting leg. But the breaking point did not come with a shout, it came with a spill. One humid evening, a young novice, a boy barely 16, new to the order, was assigned the duty of bringing Peregrine his broth. The boy tried to be brave. He marched down the corridor holding the wooden tray with a white-knuckled grip, holding his breath as he approached the source of the miasma. But as Peregrine opened the door, the draught carried the heavy, cloying scent of advanced gangrene directly into the boy's face. Nature took over. The biological reflex was faster than the boy's charity. He gagged, his stomach convulsing violently. The tray clattered to the floor. the broth splashing across the stones and mixing with the dark, purulent discharge tracking from Peregrine's bandages. The novice fell to his knees, retching, tears of shame streaming down his face as he looked up at the older monk with pure terror, not of the man, but of the contamination. Peregrine did not scold him. He did not turn away. He simply lowered himself, painful inch by painful inch, picking up the broken shards of the bowl with his trembling hands. "Go, child," he whispered, his voice cracking with a sorrow deeper than the wound. "The air is better outside." That night, Peregrine did not eat. He sat alone among the pottery shards, realizing that he had become something that even love could not stomach. The decision, when it came, was devastating in its practicality. The prior, the father of the community, had to weigh the needs of the many against the suffering of the one. He called Peregrine to him. One can imagine the scene. The prior, sitting behind his desk, trying to maintain a posture of authority while keeping a safe distance. Peregrine standing as always, leaning on his stick, his face pale and beaded with sweat, the shame burning hotter than his fever. The words were likely gentle, couched in the language of concern, but the meaning was a knife to the heart. Peregrine was asked to withdraw. He was relieved of his communal duties. He was told not to come to the choir for the offices, not to eat in the refectory with the others. He was to remain in his cell, or in a designated area, away from the main flow of monastic life. He was effectively excommunicated by his own body. For a man who had once thrived on the adoration of the crowds in the piazzas of Forlì, who had later found his identity in the brotherhood of the Servites, this was a death sentence more cruel than the gangrene. He was cast out. He became a leper in his own home. The isolation was total. He was moved perhaps to a cell in a more remote part of the priory, a place where the smell would not offend the sensitive noses of the visitors or the novices. There, the silence was absolute. No more shared laughter during recreation, no more whispered confidences after compline, no more the comforting warmth of a brother's shoulder next to his in the pew. This was the social isolation that stripped Peregrine of his humanity. He was reduced to a problem to be managed, a biological hazard. The brothers still brought him food, but the interactions became brief, functional. A tray left at the door, a hurried "God bless you," before retreating back to the clean air of the cloister. Peregrine saw the look in their eyes, the involuntary flinch, the holding of breath, the pity mixed with revulsion. He saw that he had become a monster to them. He was the thing in the corner, the reminder of mortality that everyone wanted to forget. In the solitude of his quarantine, the psychological torture began. The mind, left alone with pain and rejection, begins to eat itself. Peregrine wrestled with the darkest of thoughts. Was this God's rejection? Had his penance been an act of pride all along? Was he being punished not for his sins, but for his arrogance in thinking he could endure such a vow? The devil, the enemy of human nature, whispers loudly in empty rooms. "Look at you," the voice would say. "You are rotting. You are disgusting. Even your brothers cannot stand you. Do you think God wants you? You are filth." He felt the crushing weight of uselessness. A monk's life is one of service, to God and to his community. But what service could he render now? He could not preach. His presence drove people away. He could not work. His body was broken. He was a burden, a drain on the monastery's resources. The shame of being a parasite gnawed at him. He was a man who had once commanded respect, and now he was an object of charity, fed like a sick animal in a cage. Yet it was in this crucible of loneliness that Peregrine's sanctity was forged. Stripped of human consolation, stripped of the validation of his peers, he had nowhere to turn but inward. He had to find God not in the beautiful liturgy or the harmonious chant, but in the stench and the silence. He began to pray in a new way. It was no longer the prayer of the strong, offering feats of endurance. It was the prayer of the destitute, the cry of the broken. He realized that his value did not lie in his standing, or his preaching, or his reputation. His value lay simply in the fact that he was loved by Christ, even in his rot. He turned his cell into a sanctuary. He spoke to the rats that skittered across the stone floor in the night. He spoke to the spiders weaving their webs in the corners. He befriended the silence. He accepted the revulsion of his brothers as a just humiliation, a way to kill the last remnants of the vanity that had once led him to slap a saint. He offered his loneliness for the lonely, his rejection for the rejected. He became in those long fevered nights the patron saint of the unwanted. But the disease cares nothing for spiritual breakthroughs. By the year 1325, the gangrene had advanced to a critical stage. The toxins were overwhelming his system. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, his body wasting away as the infection consumed more calories than he could ingest. The smell had become a solid wall of corruption. The prior, seeing that the end was near and fearing that the infection might spread, or simply out of a mercy to end the suffering, called for the physician. Enter Paulo Salasio. He was a man of science, a surgeon of the 14th century, which meant he was a man acquainted with the gruesome. He arrived at the monastery with his tools, saws of varying teeth, knives sharpened on leather strops, irons for cauterization, and strong ropes to bind the patient. He was led to Peregrine's cell, wrapping a cloth soaked in vinegar around his face to ward off the miasma. The examination was brief and brutal. Salasio likely used a probe to test the depth of the necrosis, poking into the dead flesh to see where the feeling stopped and the living nerve began. Peregrine would have watched this through a haze of fever, feeling the prodding as a distant dull pressure or a sudden sharp fire where the tissue was still alive. Salasio straightened up, his eyes grave above the mask. The verdict was delivered with the dispassionate authority of a judge. "The leg must go," Salasio announced. "The corruption has reached the bone. It is ascending towards the knee. If we do not amputate, the poison will reach the heart within days." It was a death sentence disguised as a cure. Amputation in the Middle Ages was a horrific gamble. Without anesthesia, the shock alone killed many patients on the table. Those who survived the shock often died days later from secondary infections or blood loss. And even if he survived, Peregrine would be a cripple, a legless beggar dependent on the charity of others for the rest of his life. The man who had vowed never to sit would never stand again. The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. The brothers were informed. There was a flurry of activity, preparing the table, boiling the water, gathering the linens. Peregrine was left alone for one final night. He was told to prepare his soul, for it was very likely he would meet his Maker on the morrow. This was the nadir of his existence. He was 65 years old. He was alone. He was rotting. And tomorrow he would be butchered. The fear must have been suffocating, the physical terror of the saw, the anticipation of the agony, the grief for his lost limb. Most men would have collapsed into hysteria or total despair. But Peregrine Laziosi did not collapse. He did something that defies reason. He decided that if he was to lose his leg, he would not lose it in this cell of isolation. He would go to the feet of the only one who understood what it meant to be pierced and broken. With a strength born of desperation, Peregrine dragged himself up. He ignored the screaming protest of his nerves. He ignored the weakness of his muscles. He opened the door of his cell and stepped out into the dark corridor. He began the long, agonizing journey to the chapter room. He dragged his rotting leg over the stone flags, leaving a trail of fluid behind him, a snail's track of suffering. He was going to meet his judge, but first he was going to meet his Savior. The journey from his cell to the chapter room was a pilgrimage measured not in miles, but in inches of agony. For a healthy man, it was a walk of perhaps 2 minutes, a quick stride through the cloistered corridors of the priory. For Peregrine Laziosi, on the night of the 4th of May, 1325, it was a Via Dolorosa. He could not stand. The leg that had supported his penance for 3 decades had finally capitulated, becoming a dead weight of rotting meat that dragged behind him like a shackle. He was forced to crawl. He moved like a wounded animal, pulling himself forward with his hands, his knuckles scraping against the cold, uneven flagstones. The silence of the monastery was absolute, amplified by the late hour, broken only by the ragged, wet sound of his breathing and the soft, dragging noise of his infected limb. Behind him, on the stone floor, he left a glistening trail of purulence and dark blood, a physical map of his suffering that marked the path of his final retreat. Every movement sent shock waves of nausea through his body. The fever, which had been his constant companion for weeks, distorted the shadows of the corridor, turning the archways into gaping mouths and the flickering candlelight into dancing demons. Yet, his mind was fixed on a singular destination. He did not go to the chapel where the Blessed Sacrament was kept, perhaps feeling unworthy to approach the altar in his condition, or perhaps because the chapter room held a specific significance for him. The chapter room was the place of governance and discipline, the place where the rule of St. Augustine was read, where faults were confessed, and where the community gathered to deliberate. It was the heart of the order's brotherhood, the very circle from which he had been excluded. By dragging himself there, Peregrine was, in a sense, forcing his way back into the heart of his family for one last goodbye. When he finally pushed open the heavy wooden door of the chapter room, he was nearly unconscious. The room was vast and shadowed, smelling of old wood and beeswax. At the far end, illuminated by the dying embers of a votive lamp, was the fresco. It was a painting of the crucifixion, stark and imposing, depicted in the style of the time, somber, realistic, emphasizing the weight of the Savior's body and the sorrow of his sacrifice. Peregrine collapsed at the foot of the wall, directly beneath the painted feet of Christ. He arranged his broken body as best he could, leaning his back against the cold stone, his rotting legs stretched out before him, a grotesque offering to the beautiful image above. He looked up. In the dim light, the eyes of the painted Christ seemed to look down at him. There was a profound mirror between the man on the cross and the man on the floor. Both were rejected by their people. Both were in agonizing pain. Both were waiting for death. Peregrine did not pray for a cure. The historical accounts and the psychological reality of his state suggest that a request for a miracle was the furthest thing from his mind. He was a realist. He knew the leg was dead. He knew the doctor was coming with the saw. His prayer was not a petition for magic, but a surrender of the will. He prayed for the strength to endure the butchery of the morning. He prayed that he would not scream and blaspheme when the iron hit the bone. He prayed that his death, if it came on the operating table, would be accepted as the final payment for the sins of his youth, for the slap he had delivered to Philip Benizzi so many years ago. Lord, he might have whispered, his voice cracked and dry, I have stood for you until I could stand no more. Now I sit, now I lay. Take this leg, take this life. It is yours. Exhaustion, heavy and narcotic, began to pull him under. The pain in his leg, usually a sharp screaming presence, began to throb with a duller, more rhythmic cadence, merging with the beating of his own heart. He drifted into a state that was neither fully awake nor fully asleep, a hypnagogic twilight, where the boundaries of the material world began to dissolve. The stone floor seemed to soften. The smell of gangrene seemed to fade, replaced by a scent that he could not identify, something like lilies or the air after a storm. It was in this liminal space on the threshold of unconsciousness that the miracle unfolded. It did not happen with a burst of light or a choir of angels. It happened with the quiet intimacy of a dream that is more real than waking life. Peregrine watched, paralyzed by a sudden reverent awe, as the fresco on the wall began to change. The paint, which had been dry and static for years, seemed to gain depth and liquidity. The figure of Christ, flat against the plaster, began to breathe. He saw the chest of the Savior heave with the effort of respiration. He saw the muscles in the painted arms tense. And then, in a movement that defied all reason, the figure detached itself from the cross. There was no sound of tearing wood or pulling nails. There was simply the fluid, silent motion of God stepping into time. Jesus leaned forward, his crown of thorns sharp and terrifyingly real, and reached down from the wall. He did not descend as a conqueror, he descended as a physician. He moved with a sorrowful grace, his eyes locked onto Peregrine, not with judgment, but with an infinite crushing tenderness. Peregrine tried to shrink back. The shame of his condition was overwhelming. He was a rotting thing, a source of contagion. And here was purity itself approaching him. He wanted to hide his leg, to cover the black oozing flesh with his habit, to scream, "Do not touch me, for I am unclean." But he could not move. He was pinned by the gaze of the Christ. Jesus knelt on the stone floor of the chapter room. The distance between the Creator and the creature vanished. The Savior reached out his hand, a hand that bore the wound of the nail, a wound that mirrored Peregrine's own suffering, and extended it toward the gangrenous limb. Peregrine braced himself. He expected the touch to burn. He expected the holiness of God to sear the corruption of his flesh like a cauterizing iron. He closed his eyes, trembling, waiting for the final annihilation. But when the hand touched his leg, it was cool. It was a coolness that defied description. It was not the cold of ice which bites and numbs, but the coolness of water from a deep underground spring. It was a sensation of absolute liquid peace. The hand of Christ did not just touch the skin. It seemed to pass through the bandages, through the necrosis, reaching deep into the marrow of the bone. Where the hand rested, the pain stopped. It didn't just fade, it ceased. The throbbing, the burning, the deep grinding ache of the osteomyelitis. It was all silenced instantly, like a candle blown out in a gale. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Peregrine's body was not screaming at him. The tension drained from his shoulders. The fever that had boiled his blood evaporated, leaving his mind crystal clear. In the dream, or was it a dream, Jesus looked at Peregrine one last time. He did not speak. There was no sermon, no instruction. There was only a slight nod, a shared understanding between two souls who knew the weight of the cross. Then slowly the figure withdrew. The hand lifted. Jesus rose and with the same silent, fluid motion returned to the wall. The flesh became paint. The breath became plaster. The image was once again just an image, static and silent in the gloom of the chapter room. Peregrine fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. It was the sleep of a child, the restorative slumber of the completely healed, a state of rest he had not known since he was a boy in the fields of Forli. He woke to the sound of birds. The sun was streaming through the high windows of the chapter room, casting long beams of dusty light across the floor. The air was crisp and fresh. Peregrine blinked, disoriented. For a moment, he forgot where he was. He lay there, waiting for the familiar rush of pain to greet him, the morning agony that always accompanied the return of consciousness. But there was no pain. He sat up, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked down at his leg. It was still wrapped in the heavy stained bandages from the night before. The cloth was stiff with dried pus and blood. He remembered the doctor. He remembered the saw. Panic flared in his chest. He had to get back to his cell. He had to be ready for the amputation. He moved his leg. It responded instantly, light and strong. There was no dragging weight. With trembling hands, Peregrine reached down to the bandages. His fingers fumbled with the knots. He began to unwind the linen. As the layers fell away, he expected the smell to hit him, the cloying stench of the gangrene, but there was no smell. There was only the scent of old cloth and clean skin. The final layer of bandage fell to the floor. Peregrine stared. He gasped, a sound that was half sob, half scream. The leg that had been black, swollen, and rotting the night before was gone. In its place was a limb of pristine health. The skin was smooth and unblemished, the color of healthy flesh. The varicose veins that had knotted his calf for 30 years were gone. The open ulcer, the crater that had eaten down to the bone, had vanished without a scar. The flesh was firm, the muscle tone restored. It was as if the leg belonged to a man of 20, not a man of 65 who had spent 3 decades standing. He touched it. He pressed his fingers into the calf. It was warm, alive, and pain-free. He stood up. For 30 years, standing had been an act of torture. Now he stood effortlessly. He put his full weight on the right leg. It held him solid as a rock. He took a step, then another. He walked around the empty chapter room, his gait steady, his limp erased. He looked at the fresco on the wall. The Christ looked back, silent and still. Peregrine fell to his knees, not in agony this time, but in a rapture of gratitude that shattered him completely. The silence of the morning was broken by the sound of the heavy door creaking open. It was Paolo Salazio. The doctor had arrived. Behind him were 2 assistants, carrying the grim tools of their trade, a wooden table to strap the patient down, a brazier of hot coals to heat the cauterizing irons, and the terrible jagged-toothed saw. They wore leather aprons, stained from previous surgeries. Salazio's face was set in a grim line. He was prepared for a difficult morning, prepared for the screams, prepared for the possibility that his patient would die under his hands. He stopped in the doorway, stunned. He saw the empty floor where he expected to find a crippled monk. He saw the bandages scattered like the grave clothes of Lazarus. And then he saw Peregrine. Peregrine was standing in the center of the room, illuminated by a shaft of sunlight. He was not leaning on his stick. He was not cowering in pain. He was standing tall, his arms spread wide, tears streaming down his face. "Doctor," Peregrine said, his voice ringing with a strength that had been absent for years, "you can put away your iron. The physician has already been here." Salazio dropped his bag. He walked forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. He knelt down and examined the leg. He ran his professional hands over the skin, searching for the rot, searching for the heat of infection. He found nothing but perfection. He knew the pathology of gangrene. He knew its smell, its texture, its inevitability. He knew that what he was seeing was a biological impossibility. Nature does not reverse necrosis. Death does not turn back into life. The doctor looked up at the monk. The skepticism of the man of science collided with the reality of the miracle. In that collision, the doctor was defeated and the believer was born. Salazio began to weep. He kissed the foot that, by all rights, he should have been severing from the body. A miracle, Salazio whispered, his voice trembling. A true miracle. The news exploded out of the chapter room and swept through the monastery like a holy fire. The brothers, who had been cowering in their cells or praying in the chapel for Peregrine's soul, came running. They crowded into the room, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. They saw the man they had shunned, the man they had isolated because of his stench, now standing whole and radiant among them. The smell of death was gone, replaced by the electric atmosphere of the supernatural. The isolation was over. The brothers fell upon him, embracing him, weeping, asking for his forgiveness for their rejection. Peregrine, in his humility, did not rebuke them. He did not say, "Where were you when I was rotting?" He simply smiled and pointed to the fresco. It was him, he said, only him. But the miracle did not end with the healing of a leg. It continued in the healing of a heart. For the next 20 years, Peregrine became a different kind of priest. He became the patron of the untouchables. When the sick came to the monastery, those with leprosy, with open sores, with the same foul-smelling ulcers that had once imprisoned him, the other brothers would recoil, covering their noses with vinegar-soaked cloths. Peregrine did not recoil. The barrier of disgust had been burned away by his own suffering. He would kneel before a beggar with a rotting foot, and he would see not the filth but the mirror of his own past agony. He washed their wounds with bare hands. He did not turn his face away from the stench. He leaned into it. Observers were shocked to see him kiss the sores of the dying, offering them the same tenderness that the physician had offered him on that dark night in the chapter room. He knew the geography of their pain because he had lived there. He was no longer just a holy man preaching from a pulpit. He was a wounded healer who could look a dying man in the eye and say, I know how it burns, and I know you are not alone." Peregrine Laziosi died on May 1st, 1345. But the narrative of his flesh defied the grave. 3 centuries later, when his tomb was opened, his body was found incorrupt, preserved in a state of perfection that mocked the passage of time. The leg that had once been consumed by gangrene remained whole, a final seal on his sanctity. Today, in the sterile corridors of modern oncology wards, Peregrine has become the patron saint of cancer patients, the silent companion to millions fighting their own biological wars. His life remains a testament to the idea that there is no tissue so dead it cannot be revitalized, and no life so wasted it cannot be redeemed. The rebel who became a saint stands as eternal proof that even in the darkest night of suffering, the physician is coming. Peregrine's journey from a violent rebel to a saint of silence is just one chapter in the vast, often forgotten library of human endurance. We are dedicated to unearthing these stories, lives that remind us of the strength hidden within our own frailty. If this narrative resonated with you, please consider marking your presence with a like and subscribing to our channel. It helps us keep these candles of history lit. And now, we turn to you. History is full of figures who found light in the deepest darkness. Whose story should we tell next? Who is the unsung hero or the misunderstood villain that deserves to be heard? Leave their name in the comments below. Let us continue this exploration of history's shadow and light together.